So this video lesson is all about dividing decimals. And much like we did when we looked at multiplying decimals, we're going to review a little bit of how you divide and what the process is and how we can interpret division when we're involving whole numbers. And then we're going to extend it into decimals based on the relationship between whole numbers and decimal numbers that have the same digits, just a different location for the decimal points. And so, for example, if we wanted to talk about a whole number division, we could talk about something like 575 divided by 25. We could also write that division, 575 divided by 25, as a fraction. And we're going to come back to this idea of writing division as a fraction because we're familiar with creating equivalent fractions and moving back and forth between different versions of those same fractions. If you don't remember that phrase itself, it's like moving between 1/2, 2/4, 3/6, 30/60ths, things like that by multiplying or dividing the numerator and denominator by the same thing. And that's how we're going to talk about the difference between decimal division and regular division. So let's go ahead and look at an idea that we might actually come up against. Let's say we have a whole bunch of lumber. In fact, we have 98 feet of lumber. But what we need is not 98 feet of lumber. We need 98 feet of lumber in segments of 3.5 feet per piece. So we need to split this 98 feet down into segments that have 3.5 feet per piece. And if we're going to take a big group of things like that and split it down into smaller pieces, of course, that is division. So we're going to need to do 98 divided by 3.5 to find out how many different pieces it is that we're going to need. Well, if we go through and we actually do this division without making any adjustments for the decimal point, we're going to end up with a number that is completely and totally unreasonable according to what our regular division process is. And in fact, 98 divided by 3.5 would give us, without changing the decimal point, would give us an answer of 2.8. Now, obviously, if it's 3.5 feet per piece, we're not going to have 2.8 pieces make up an entire 98 feet of lumber. So instead, we're going to look at 98 and 3.5 and say, okay, we want whole numbers. And if we write these things as a fraction, 98 over 3.5, then we can start to say, okay, well, 3.5, we can't leave it as a decimal because our division algorithm, which is what this is called, our algorithm doesn't allow for decimals in it. So we need a way of getting rid of this decimal point. Now, to get rid of a decimal point, or to move a decimal point within a number, that's one of the shortcuts that we learned in lower school that comes from multiplying and dividing by 10. So if we took 98 and 3.5 and divided and multiplied the numerator and denominator both by 10, we end up with a fraction that means the same thing. This is the whole point of creating equivalent fractions. Well, 98 times 10 is 980. 3.5 times 10 is 35. And so we find out that 98 divided by 3.5 is actually the exact same division, or gives you the exact same quotient as 980 divided by 35. And so we're going to use that idea, just with a little bit of a shortcut, to find that division for us. So 98 divided by 3.5, the same answer as 980 divided by 35. And so the way that we look at that, if we draw another division box down here, is we want to take this decimal point and we want it to be over at the end of our divisor so we don't have any decimals there. Well, we did that by multiplying it by 10. We shifted the decimal place by 1 point. What we're going to do in the dividend, then, is do the same thing. We have to shift the decimal point one place to the right. We don't have any more interesting digits, but there is a 0 after that decimal point. So the decimal point is going to be placed there, and then it always pops up into the quotient from the dividend, wherever it is that it happens to be once we shift it. Now, once we shift these two decimal points here, that's it. We're done. We leave the decimal point where it is. We don't need to worry about moving it back, adjusting for anything else. That just is what it is. And so there's a few things now that I'm going to ask you to write down before we do a few example problems. The first is we can't divide with a decimal there. We can't divide with a decimal in the divisor, because that will give us a decimal point in the wrong place. So you're going to write down this example problem. You're not going to actually calculate it yet. We can't divide with a decimal in the divisor. We have to move it over to the right, so 0.15 becomes 15. So you're going to write down these two things, the example problem and this whole piece right there. So go ahead, pause the video, write those down, come back when you're ready to move on. Next, after we actually have moved that decimal point 2 places to the right, we need to adjust the same way in the dividend. We have to move both decimal points, otherwise our answer will be very different from the actual answer. So you're going to write this phrase down, and you're going to write this one down. The decimal point in the quotient goes in the same place value as the new number being divided, the new dividend. So the decimal point just pops straight up into the quotient. So write those two things down that are starred. Show in your problem that you have moved the decimal point over 2 places, and we'll see it in 2 example problems here that will take us through that process a little bit more. But for right now, write those 2 things down, because that's the process, and then come back when you're ready to move on. So we move the decimal points over in the divisor, move this decimal point over by the same number of places in the dividend, and then we just divide, because now we have a division that we're familiar with working with. So 15 doesn't go into 14 at all, but it goes into 146 9 times. 9 times 15 is 135. Go through that, that becomes 1, 1, 2. 15 times 7 is 105, which is what we want there. Take that away, get 75, and then 15 goes into 75 5 times, because 15 times 5 is, in fact, 75. So our quotient here is 975. 0.15 goes into 146.25 975 times, not 9.75, which is what the answer would be if we left the decimal places as they are. We have to move the decimal. But we don't care if there's a decimal in the dividend. This number is fine. We can have a decimal there. It's just the divisor that can't have a decimal. So let's take a look at one more example of that. 7.5 being divided into 427.2. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to move that decimal point. We need to adjust the decimal place by 1 in the divisor, so we need to adjust it by 1 in the dividend also, and then the decimal point pops up into our answer. 75 doesn't go into 42, but it does go into 427 5 times. 75 times 5 is 375. And 427 minus 375 is 52. Now we have 522. 75 goes into 522 6 times. 6 times 75 is 450. 522 minus 450 is 72. And now we have, we drop down a 0 here to get to 720, because that is our next digit. 720 allows 75 to go into it 9 times. 75 times 9 is 675. 720 minus 675 is 45. Drop the 0 down, and it goes in 6 times. So 56.96. Now remember, dropping a 0, dropping a digit is a natural part of division. You do not add a 0 in the quotient unless it really does go in 0 times after you've dropped the first digit. So now we have a few different practice problems for you. Remember, adjust the decimal point, then just divide as normal. Go ahead and work on these. If you don't need to adjust the decimal point, that's fine. If you do, adjust it and divide. Come back when you're ready to move on. So here we have 574.75 divided by 11. There's no adjustment necessary because 11 is what it is. Do not move the decimal point in this case. You can to clear it in the divisor, but then you end up the dividend, but then you end up dividing by 1100. And dividing by 1100 is a little bit absolutely crazy because it's a bigger number than you really need to worry about. And so when you actually do the division, you get 52.25. I won't go through the whole process there, but that's the quotient you want. Next, 0.114 divided by 1.9. We have to adjust the decimal place once. because of the decimal in the divisor. 0.114 divided by 1.9 actually gives you 0.06, because 19 times 6 is 114. Notice that 19 doesn't go into 11, so we do have a 0 in the quotient, and every time we move to the right of a decimal point, we have to adjust, of course, we have to account for every single place, because place value zeros to the left in decimals are important. 2 more problems for you to work on. Go ahead, pause the video, do these divisions, and come back when you are ready to move on. So for 1596.96 divided by 0.16, again, we need to move the decimal point over by 2 in the divisor, so it gets moved over by 2 in the dividend. The decimal point pops up, and we end up with 9,381 as our quotient. And then finally, 1379.24 divided by 4.1. Adjust one place for the decimal, and only one, so we don't divide by anything bigger than we need to. Pop that straight up into our quotient, and when we actually do the division, we end up with a quotient of 336.4. So division with decimals is almost identical to division with whole numbers. We just need to adjust the decimal point. Our divisor cannot have a decimal point, so we need to adjust for that, and then we do division as normal.